exiles tend to function in one way or the other. You either are perpetually weeping for the lost homeland, or you realize that the sun will shine on you wherever you are, and you learn to be at home everywhere else in the world. He has this dream that has been shared with me by his daughter Hortensia, and in this dream a figure takes him. He asks to go see his home in Matanzas, and the figure takes him like an angel, traveling with you through the skies, shows him his homeland. He sees it, he sees his home, and then all of a sudden there is a fury of galloping horses, and before you know it, he's back here in Miami. And I think we can only read that dream or vision as a reckoning, a kind of both closing and opening a door.
My father came at 42. He was already a mature, established artist, and he gets here and he has nothing. He is a nobody. He is a nobody.
I can see people not wanting to work again and losing that spirit. Makes total sense. But when you've got that inside you, you may explode if you don't paint it.
Even in his geometrics, you see a lot of profundity in the colors, in the textures. You can see that he was yearning for something to go beyond that. And as we looked at his mature works, everything that we saw pointed to this spiritual and mystic element.
It hit me very deeply and very viscerally, and you see this face looking up in anguish. And I thought nobody could have expressed that as well as Soriano did. It looks like this figure is sort of fading into this purpley background, and I just imagine is really how it feels when you're losing control of your faculties.
In this new artistic vocabulary that he developed while in exile, I think reflects that need to enter into and to engage the experience of trauma and loss, and nevertheless to do it in a way that in the end is hopeful, in the end leads one through the darkness into the light, a light that one sees in virtually all of his more mature paintings.
I do think that in his late paintings from the 90s, that he is able to visualize the next world. Soriano was contemplating as well and was understanding in a way and portraying to us that there is nothing to fear in terms of taking that next step.
Rafael Soriano is part of what is generally defined as the third Cuban avant-garde. That is the third generation of modern artists that emerged in the island. He's the generation of artists born in the 1920s, and they really come of age as artists in the 40s and early 50s. And he is a pioneer in geometric and concrete abstraction. And then once he left Cuba in 1962, his work goes through one of the most extraordinary transformations, I would say, in the history of Latin American art, if not modern art in general, and becomes something that goes beyond the nature of painting and speaks of mysterious and spiritual values.
To know him and to historically know how important he was, and to honor that life and that spirit and that talent he continues to give. And I think that's the mark of a truly brilliant artist in time and eternity.
Es un encanto, se quedan embelesados con los cuadros. Sí. Así que yo le digo, bueno, Dios permite que su pintura viaje y llegue a muchas regiones donde puedan apreciarlos y ser felices con ellas.
Good evening. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm so happy to see all of you. My name is Hortensia Soriano. I am the director of the Rafael Soriano Foundation, as well as the only child of Rafael and Milagros Soriano. This catalog raisonné is dedicated to them. He, the artist, and she, the carpenter, that would make his frames, mount his canvases, and always made sure to have a fresh canvas ready for him. So they really, I don't think my father could have painted this body of work if it were not for my mom by his side. And they really made a terrific team, and I can only hope that they're up there together, smiling from above and really enjoying this moment. I want to thank Dr. Alejandro Anreus. He is the editor of this catalog raisonné and responsible for gathering this wonderful and well-respected group of scholars together to work on this project. Each of them stayed at the foundation anywhere from 3 to 5 days. They were able to live amongst the works. They were able to visit my father's home studio that sits right next door to the foundation. There's the living room, and there was his studio in the back. And they were able to take a deep dive into the archives, and they each really came up with very insightful and thoughtful essays on different periods of my father's works. I want to also thank my spouse, Lisa McEwen, for all of her love and her support and her very hard work on this catalog raisonné. We started this project 4 years ago. It was right when the pandemic hit, and what else are you to do but work on a catalog raisonné during the pandemic, right? So it was quite daunting. I'll be very honest with you. I was a little overwhelmed, and I thought it was impossible. And thanks to Susanna Shepard, who is here tonight, and with Panopticon, she really made what I thought was going to be impossible possible. And you can find a beautiful online catalog raisonné on both our websites, rafaelsorianofoundation.org and rafaelsoriano.com. And in those brochures, there's a QR code that'll take you directly there. But don't go there now because we have a great program planned for you. And now I want to introduce Dr. Alejandro Anreus, and I'll make this very brief. He was a professor of art history at William Patterson University from 2001 to 2023. In 2023, he was the Leonard Lauder Visiting Senior Scholar at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at the National Gallery of Art. And he sat at the Joan Mitchell Foundation on the board for 10 years, and 5 of those years as president. And he is now president emeritus. And he is the author of countless books and one soon-to-be-released book called Havana in the 1940s, Artists, Critics, and Exhibitions. And I'm super looking forward to reading that. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Alejandro Anreus.
Buenas noches, good evening. I want to stress that the only reason this Catalogue Raisonné exists is because of those 2 women on the front row, the work of Hortensia Soriano and Lisa McEwen. And of course, it shows you that you can do something out of a labor of love, that if you're committed to it, you can do it. And it's just a matter of being stubborn and disciplined and being very thoughtful in how you follow that mission. I was very honored when Hortensia, after a couple of cafecitos, said to me, well, why don't you edit this thing? And I said to her, okay, I think it's a good idea to edit this, but why don't we think about editing this in a newer way? And what I meant by that was that Soriano is well known and highly regarded in the Cuban American community of Miami. And I felt that Soriano needed new perspectives, new voices, different ways of really framing his art, taking it outside of the Cuban American community and placing him in the larger context, which is that he is one of these artists who exist in simultaneous planes, right? He is a Cuban exile, he's a Cuban American, he's a contemporary American artist, and he is also a contemporary Latino artist, a painter obsessed with the nature of painting itself and with the metaphysical and spiritual possibilities that could be explored through the medium of painting. And so based on that and our conversations and being the usually over-caffeinated people that her and I are when we are together in Miami, we came up with this very distinguished list of scholars and contributors. So I will just tell you briefly who they are, and everyone will speak in the order in which their essays appear. Now, I should tell you that no one is going to do the traditional 20-minute College Art Association paper. Okay? First of all, we don't want to put you to sleep. And second of all, the idea is for people to speak in a very extemporaneous, relaxed manner, share with you the ideas that they explore in their essays, but really get you to then go to the Catalogue Raisonné and read the essays yourself, okay? Because that's what's so important here. Dr. Susanna Aberth, professor at Bard College and a scholar of surrealism and spirituality and theosophy, etc. Dr. Olga Herrera, an independent scholar and curator. Her recent exhibition was a retrospective of Maria Luisa Pacheco at the Art Museum of the Americas in Washington, D.C. Elizabeth Goizueta, or Elizabeth Thompson Goizueta, who is an independent scholar associated for many years with the McEwen Museum at Boston College and a curator of significant exhibitions on Roberto Mata, on Wilfredo Lam, on Mariano Rodriguez, and the first traveling retrospective of Soriano, The Artist as Mystic, which opened in 2017. Susanna Temkin, who is the curator at the Museo del Barrio, and Dr. Susanna Temkin, and Dr. Harper Montgomery, who is a professor of art history at Hunter College. Each of them focused on different aspects of Soriano's life and work. Elizabeth basically has written the introduction to the Catalogue Raisonné, framing him in the larger context that then each of the authors will pursue. Everyone will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes in an informal manner, and then we will open it up to Q&A, okay? And luckily, there's only, I would say, 2.5 Cubans on the podium, because you all know the problem with Cubans in front of microphones, as Cabrera Infante used to say. So we're going to keep it very controlled in that sense. So on that, I leave Elizabeth Thompson Goizueta to do the introduction. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alejandro, and it's a real delight. I'm going to put this up here to be with all of you tonight and to see so many familiar faces and to share the joy of Rafael Soriano, especially with these two wonderful, hardworking ladies. So it is my distinct honor and privilege to be with you tonight to celebrate the launch of the Catalogue Raisonné and to participate in this panel with my esteemed colleagues. So I'm really delighted to be here tonight. Now, I have the easier of the tasks because I am tasked to do an introduction. And I think that the best way, perhaps, to do that introduction, not knowing that we were going to already see the video, was just to show you some installation shots of some of the exhibitions so that you can get an idea of the art. So I am going to show us the first slide. On the right, you see Rafael Soriano, the artist as mystic, that we opened in Boston College at McEwen Museum at Boston College in 2017. And if you look to the left, you see a very similar, of course, black and white photograph of a joint exhibition at the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in 1955, which was a joint exhibition between Rafael Soriano, and you can see his works. I miss my pointer from being a teacher. You can see his works on the walls, and Agustín Cárdenas, who was a sculptor, a very well-known sculptor, and this was smack dab in the middle of the decade of 1955, which had its bookends, you know, with the coup of Batista, and then we have on 1959 the Cuban Revolution, which I'll get back to. But what we attempted to do at the McEwen Museum was to recreate this gallery, this show in our galleries because of its historical significance, explaining the evolution in the 50s, the artistic evolution of abstraction. So Agustín Cardinal represents, first, he was a member of Los Once, which was
a group in the earlier part of the 50s that really celebrated abstraction, but organic abstraction. So the natural world became very much an inspiration for their work. So you can kind of see that. And then you see in the color, perhaps a little bit better off the right-hand side, we are actually able to gather 24 of these concrete or geometric abstraction paintings from Rafael Soriano, 4 of which had been in the original exhibition in 1955. This was not an easy task because a lot of those are unknown in terms of where they are, and some have actually been forged, that dirty word that we have in the art industry. I'm making a point and resting a bit here on this exhibition, on this slide, because it really speaks to what was happening in the 50s. And we will return to some of these ideas, but basically, Agustín Cárdenas looks to the organic, whereas our friend Rafael Soriano looks to the cerebral, kind of imposed conceits of abstraction that is manifested in these kind of geometric hard-edged shapes. So I promise we'll move very fast now. Now this is just because you're going to indulge me a bit, but I wanted to show you some of the installation shots so that you could understand the mood that was created also by having these works of art on the walls. So this is another beautiful shot. We actually ran meditations in this gallery, and you can kind of understand why, and the students really responded positively to this. But he has a luminosity that first struck me that was equally important in the geometric abstract paintings as it is in his later paintings. And so you can see this kind of luminosity that just emanates from the work. This exhibition traveled in 2017 to California, the Long Beach Museum of Art, and was very successful there. And that's where this wonderful director, David Schler, who did the, we saw a little clip of his documentary. He came across it, was inspired, and decided to do the documentary. So you never know what will happen in life's passing. And then it ended up at the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum in Miami, Florida. And there it was extremely successful and positive as well. It continued in 2019 to, we went to Havana, not with the paintings as we had wished for obvious political reasons, but we were able to take this wonderful documentary and we were able to present it at a premiere in La Habana at the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes and have a question and answer period afterwards. So imagine that these people only have in their collection, only have in the repository of their minds, the abstract paintings. And they see the same clip that you saw and they're thinking, ¿Qué pasó? Like, what happened? We also brought it to Matanzas, which is actually the city from which Rafael Soriano hails, and we had a wonderful reception there as well with the people. So he continues in popularity. This is in 2019. This was an exhibition that was curated by Alejandro Anreus, here to my left, that was extremely popular and very unique because he took the heads, las cabezas, these head portraitures, and focused in, drilled down on these portraitures, which is very unique and something that I think Hortensia had always wanted to see manifest itself. So you see an example here. That exhibition actually the cabezas went to Washington, D.C., Art of the Americas at the Organization of American States, and then traveled to Miami, also the Museum of Cuban Diaspora. So, you know, it is now between the exhibition that I curated and Alejandro curated and David Schler, we're getting international, national attention, so much to the extent that we were invited to travel to Madrid and open an abbreviated version of The Artist is Mystic that opened at the McEwen Museum. And we presented it at the prestigious Casa de las Americas, last year in 2023. Now 2024 sees not only the launch of this wonderful Catalogue Raisonné, but it also sees the collection of Rafael Soriano's works in prestigious museums like the Whitney Museum, the National Gallery Museum, the Smithsonian. The archives will also go to the Smithsonian at a future point. So it is indisputable that there is this renaissance of interest and scholarship on this artist. And I think what happens, this renaissance, is really demanding that we re-examine Rafael Soriano's position in the 20th century canon, both nationally and internationally. So I pause here at this because the installation shot on the right, you can see that you have the geometrics on the walls, and in the back you can see that we have paintings from the late period. So the most often question that I received was, ¿Qué pasó? How did he go from the geometric to these late organic imagery that's mysterious, oniric, still very much layered in terms of the colors? He was always a master in the colors, in the geometrics as well as the later period. But we can see that there is in form this great transition. The answer for that takes us back to 1959. And in 1959, there were two pivotal events that happened. In the art world, it was this kind of embrace, if you will, of this concrete, cerebral abstraction that was very much conceptual. And so it was defined by these hard-edged forms and geometrics, right? And so the organic was waning and the geometrics were waxing. And so what Rafael Soriano decides to do at the end of 1958, the beginning of 1959, is create a movement of like-minded artists to create this movement called Los 10 Pintores Concretos, 10 concrete painters. And so he does this in conjunction almost with the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, which was a social, political, and artistic upheaval, because now we have this abstraction, which is no longer in accordance with the revolution's motives. By 1961, communists had been embraced, and so too its subsequent expression of art. And many artists that stayed had to change their form of expression to coincide with what was now being determined to be that expression of art. And others left. Soriano in 1961 left, came to Miami, and began from scratch. But he was so traumatized that he was unable to paint for several years. And when he did paint, it looked like this. Well, that's the inspiration for this. This is La Soledad, 1975. So this is what we call its transition piece. And as you can see, and I'm going to just end very soon, as you can see, we still have geometrics. But what is happening to those geometrics? They're morphing. They're becoming more organic. They're more sculptural. They're three-dimensional, right? He is embracing what he had rejected before with his cerebral kind of interpretation. He goes back to that first slide that I showed you in Agustin Cardenas, right? And he starts thinking about that, and he starts creating a new type of expression. So I'm just gonna run through these very quickly because you saw some of them. But I think what is really fascinating about these works, besides this technique that he has of layering, which creates this luminosity and these kind of jewel-toned, deep, deep colors that cannot be faked, is he moves really from the physical to the metaphysical. He moves from the rigid geometrics to the organic. And so we see an evolution within the soul and the person as well as the artist. So for me, I think the point that I want to make on this, and this is one of the ones that we saw before in the documentary, is that Rafael Soriano, at the height of New York pop art, minimalist art, this is how he's painting. This is not an easy pill to swallow. This is a powerful painting, right? This is a powerful style of painting, but it is not in line with the popular movements of the time. And so I named my essay The Courage of Rafael Soriano because he had the courage to follow the singular vision that he had, the courage to paint his own vision, right? And that is kind of what prophets and mystics do, right? And maybe now, a little bit later, we are able to celebrate and appreciate even more the work of Rafael Soriano. Muchas gracias.
I will speak to you briefly about the topic of my essay and show you some images, and then I will move quickly into the essay of Professor Abby McEwen, who unfortunately could not be with us today because of her teaching schedule. And I will just show you some slides and point out a couple of the things that she explores in her essay. The title of my essay is Young Soriano, from San Alejandro to La Caseta. And a couple of things that I decided to zero in on was, first of all, to include student work, the little of student work that we had available, which is not traditionally included in Catalogue Raisonné. But I think in his case, they give us a hint of what he will pursue in terms of color and form. But I also think it's something rather poignant because it's about reconstructing the life of an artist whose life was destroyed by political turmoil and exile. And so I think it's also a way of showing us the remains of what we have of his beginnings as a young artist. Very important for you to be aware of the fact that he is part of a generation of artists who were the last to be traditionally trained by the great maestros of San Alejandro. They were the last ones to be trained by Leopoldo Romagnac. But most significantly also about Soriano is that he is an artist that receives a double education. That is the equivalent of what today would be 2 BFAs. He studied painting, so he completed the program of painting, and then he also studied sculpture, where he was also a student of one of the great modern artists of Cuba, which was the sculptor Juan José Sicre. Okay? So keep that in mind whenever you look at his work and the way he plays with his very unique notion of color, but also his very solid sculptural sense of form. And here you have some photos of him. He came from a modest family. He was born in Sidra, grew up in Matanzas. His father was a barber. He came from a large family, a number of siblings. His mother was a homemaker. But interestingly enough, his family encouraged him as an artist from the very beginning, his talents as an artist. And a very significant thing also about his father was that his father was a seer. His father had visions, and his father would recommend remedies. So something that I'm sure Susan Aberth will explore in her essay. The other key thing is also the social and class background of Soriano. Soriano is part of a generation that is personally picked by the painter Armando Menocal. And in the 1940s, starting in the late 30s, Menocal, before he died, decided to create a series of scholarships for these young men who came from modest social backgrounds. Okay? These included Soriano, this included Roberto Diago, it included Roberto Estopiñán, and many others. And they were known within San Alejandro as los muchachos del viejo Menocal. Okay? Now, I want you to understand what that meant also in terms of their solidarity, in terms of their identity, their class identity, but also their generational identity in comparison to the earlier generation of artists, right? The first vanguardia and the second vanguardia. I just love to look at photos of him as a young man walking down streets of Havana. This is the earliest image that we have by him, and it is a drawing from 1934 when he was 14 years of age. And he was a student at the local art school by Tarasco, who was a Catalan who opened a local art school in Matanzas. Okay? Now look at the shift in just 4 years. This is a still life that he paints in Romagnac's class of Colorido. And I think you can already see that he is going beyond the traditionally descriptive academic way of painting. Look at how he's emphasizing certain colors and a very straightforward sense of form, right? And then by 1941, he's clearly reflecting the influence of the earlier vanguardia. In this case, you can see the influence of Fidelio Ponce. And for Soriano, both Ponce and Victor Manuel were role models in that these were artists who chose not to follow the academic tradition and who were also outsiders, these marginal figures within Cuban society. Even though Soriano will choose to go back home to Matanzas and be one of the founders of the art school there. By 1946, he's doing a series of pen and inks. I think here we can clearly see a little bit of the influence of the Mexican school, but beyond that also the influence of a member of the second vanguardia, the pen and ink drawings of Luis Martinez Pedro, particular kind of drawings that were actually exhibited in the 1944 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, Modern Cuban Painters. But look within the year how he's already going beyond this kind of figuration to something much more experimental and clearly reflecting his metaphysical and spiritual concerns. At the heart of this period is that he will be part of the generation that is among the founders of the Escuela de Bellas Artes in Matanzas, together with Rodolfo Tardo, Jose Núñez Booth, and he will bring his dear friend Roberto Diago to join the faculty. What is significant about this art school is twofold. One, that it reflects, contrary to the easy histories that we get of Cuba before 1959, it reflects that this is one of Cuba's most dynamic democratic periods in spite of the existing corruption and the serious attempt on the part of the governments of both Grau San Martin and Prio Socarrás of crear patria, hacer patria through culture and education. And Soriano and his generation are very much reflecting this in the creation of this art school. And what separates this art school from the other provincial art schools that would be created during that decade is that this is an art school that has faculty members who are practicing artists who work in a modern vocabulary. And if he doesn't look very happy in this photograph, and I always point this out to Hortensia, is because he's standing next to one of his arch enemies and arch enemies of his generation. And that is the society painter Esteban Valderrama, who had been director of San Alejandro and an enemy of los muchachos del viejo Menocal, because he thought that artists needed to come from the privileged classes, not the modest classes of Cuba. And of course, the culmination of this period is his exhibition at La Caseta. Okay? La Caseta, again, a gesture of that great democratic period under the Ministry of Education of Aureliano Sánchez Arango and the direction of the Director of Culture, La Dirección de Cultura, under Raúl Roa. La Caseta was a building created in the Parque Central so that everyday Cubans could come in and experience modern art. Okay? You should know that the artist that opened La Caseta in early October was Wilfredo Lam, followed by the work of Soriano. Okay? And here you see at the opening, there's Lam, there's Oloso de Villa, Diago. The paintings that he exhibits in 1950 at La Caseta, there are a group of 6 large paintings on wood, completed in 1949. And these are, I think, incredibly significant because they show you where he's going to be heading into the next decade. And I think here we will see how the curvilinear silhouettes and flat patterns will evolve into the geometric work of the 1950s. This is La Emoción. And then Músicos tocando un órgano. And I do want to read you a brief quote, and I think Susanna Temkin will enjoy this, because the best review of his exhibition at La Caseta was written by Marcelo Pogolotti, a member of the first avant-garde, an artist who had stopped painting in 1937 because of his failing eyesight. And he writes the following about Soriano, and I quote, "The painter who has just exhibited his works there belongs to that vigorous battalion of young people under 30 years of age who have set out to awaken new painting from the drowsiness into which it has been plunged for the last 3 or 4 years. He has something to say, whether with spoken word or painting. Talent aside, the others usually don't have much to say, either because they don't know how to express themselves with words, or because they are shy, suspicious, or uneducated. The young professor of decorative painting and composition at the School of Fine Arts in Matanzas passes imperceptibly from pantheism to the mystery of creation.
and from there to cosmic spaces. Objects become essences at the expense of the physical form. Hence, the semi-abstract character of this artist's painting, equidistant from formal purism and real appearance. Soriano works a lot on his paintings, as if to saturate them with the effluvium of his soul. At the same time, he expresses the static serenity of his contemplative trance by means of the rigorous balance that he imparts to the composition. Disillusionment and frustration usually reveal themselves strongly in the coloring, sometimes acid and other times gloomy. But the painter, instead of facing nothingness, like the existentialists perpetuated in their work, prefers, amid the transience of things, to see his self as an incarnation of a cosmic, eternal, and divine force. End of quote. And so he transitions into the 1950s, and the wonderful essay by Professor Abigail McEwen contextualizes him within his definitions of abstraction, as well as the definitions of abstraction by the concreto artists that he was associated with. McEwen quotes Soriano as stating in 1953, "I consider that progressively abstract art is heading toward the exaltation of our creative powers and in cementing itself as the artistic expression of our modern world." End of quote. I think among the important contributions that she brings to this essay is an emphasis on what she calls matancero poetics, the importance of the sense of place, matanzas for Soriano, his identity with matanzas, the poetic tradition of matanzas, as well as also the spirituality of the city of Matanzas. And of course, she also places him in context with his exhibitions at Lolo Soldevilla's significant Galeria Color Luz, and as Elizabeth mentioned briefly, his participation in the exhibition of Los Diez between 1959 and the final exhibition in 1961. All throughout, what we encounter is his expressive engagement with pure geometric abstraction, and one where he allows his natural painterly qualities to communicate. And from this point on, of course, history will radically change, and exile will be his next experience. And with that, I'll leave it to Susanna Temkin. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here tonight. I'm terrified to go after Alejandro, who I think is such a wonderful, dynamic speaker, but I'm grateful to him for the introduction, along with, I think, Abigail, who's not here with us, to Hortensia and Lisa. It's been just really fun to be in the archives, to be at the Casa Soriano, and to really think through Soriano's practice. I also have a Catalogue Raisonné background, so it was really wonderful to be able to go back into some of that thinking. And I think what's really beautiful about these projects is it does help us, even though we're talking about the por qué. How did Soriano move from this to this? I think I'm already seeing new threads from hearing from what we already began with what I've been thinking about in terms of his practice. And what I've been thinking about is really centered on this work called Umbral, Threshold, a work from 1968, which, as I'll describe, was an important year for him following his arrival in the United States. And of course, Umbral as a threshold, we think of a threshold as something that you simply step into or step past, but as we know, thresholds are often more messy, especially when we think in terms of exile, more complicated, many more layers. So that is what I was thinking about as I was thinking about the journey that Soriano made from this really vibrant, intellectually engaged role in Matanzas, where he had not only founded the school, but was working there, was part of this intellectual milieu, and arriving in Miami, which at the time was pretty much a cultural backwater, having to start anew, which, as he writes in a letter to José Gómez Sigre, he says, "Así es como se dice a comenzar de nuevo," starting all over again. So this is really a guiding light, kind of no pun intended, but for me, this is almost a sentinel figure, beacon-like. A lot I see as centered on visuality and profundity, and that is really what guided my thinking as I focused on his transitional years from the 60s into the 70s. If you watch interviews, or I think as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, Soriano often said that he was so shocked upon arrival that he stopped painting. But I think, as a Catalogue Raisonné can reveal, that's not always exactly totally true. He, of course, had to have a day job, provide for his family. And so he was doing things like portraits, including this portrait that was commissioned by the Catholic Diocese of Miami of Mother Cabrini, who many of you may know was the patron saint of immigrants. So she and the Catholic Welfare Bureau also kind of became a network for how he connected with the Cuban diaspora, helped him find a job. He became a designer at Editorial America, later at Cosmopolitan and Popular Mechanics. So I talk about this portrait, which Hortensia also shared was very important to her father and mother, who visited it later, at later moments in time. And this work was also painted the same year as Spacious Figure, now lost work, although perhaps with the publication of the Catalogue Raisonné, it may come to light. And if you look at 1963, it's really these two works, along with a second edition of the Mother Cabrini portrait that he produced. And this painting, which we can see it in their backyard, really, for me, it seems like it became a ticket for Soriano. He was submitting this painting to juried exhibitions, not only in Miami at the Lowe and at Burdine's Gallery, that's what we had at the time in Miami, but also sending it to Flagler, to Tampa, to the Ringling Museum, to the Norton, until it finally won the third prize at an exhibition of paintings by Cuban artists at the Museum of Science and Natural History that was sponsored by Cintas and the Cuban Association of Plastic Arts in Exile. So for me, it was really interesting to think about how this network, here he is kind of peddling his wares of sorts to all these burgeoning art centers across the nation, but he really finds initial support among the Cuban diaspora. I was also really fascinated through this process to learn about the artist's involvement with the University of Miami's Kubeck Center, which is today owned by Miami MDCC. But it's where he was working as a professor, sort of reprising his role that he had in Cuba, and where, again, he found a lot of solidarity through the Cuban Culture Program, working as an arts professor and also exhibiting his works at shows held at the University of Miami and shows held by the Cuban student associations. And among those shows, he presented Composición 1964. So both of this work and Spacious Figures that I showed previously, for me, they really seem like a continuation of what he had been working on in Cuba. But as I got to know through the Catalogue Raisonné, these were what he was showing publicly, but he was also really engaged in a lot of experimentation, which we'll begin to see. His big break, however, happens in 1968, so again, the same year that El Umbral was painted, and it's his first solo exhibition at the Pageant Gallery in downtown Miami. And for me, really interesting is, one, the title of the show, Subjective Paintings, so introducing, a new dimension into the former planar geometry that we've been seeing, and also the writing of this show is really interesting. It was written by George Volsky, who maintains a presence in a number of exhibitions that Soriano participates in, who, for the first time, instead of dwelling in his cubanidad, as kind of is the ethos of the various exhibitions he was doing at the Quebec Center, for the first time really emphasizes the cerebral nature of his works, thinks about them, he calls them in terms of a quest. And to quote very briefly, he says that his works show a, quote, painstaking and conscientious search for his meaning of reality. The show's pamphlet was accompanied by this untitled, which to me has like a crystalline form, also a cosmic form, this kind of pushing upwards. And that also, 1968, a significant year, and thinking about his work with popular mechanics, which I think still needs further studies. We see a work like La Búsqueda, a recent acquisition of the NGA, I heard some applause, which again is related to this search, but I also see it as very much, for me, it's like almost like a satellite imagery, thinking about the space race, that Hortensia also shared that the artist was very much interested in. Also thinking about, again, this quest-like quality I found in another work presented at this show was really also related to visuals. For me, you know, this is a precursor of Las Cabezas that we see later, but I think it's very interested that these lines that are emanating from the eye. Another work, so you can see the kind of, I'm saying messy, but the kind of extreme experimentation that the artist is working in that actually confused a lot of critics at the time. So the reviews are very interesting, what critics find interesting, what they are gravitating toward and not. And here I'm showing you an image of a show at the Bacardi Art Exhibition, because at the same time that Soriano is pursuing successfully these solo exhibitions, something that I found really fascinating was he was also establishing networks, not only with the Cuban community, but he founded, or he was a co-founder of a group called GALA, the Grupo de Artistas Latinoamericanos, made up of Osvaldo Gutierrez, Rosana McAllister, Jose Mijares, Enrique Reveron, and Baruch Salinas, who sadly passed a few weeks ago. And they were really, I think the solidarities that Alejandro mentioned earlier really comes out in the ethos of this group, who, as a lot of critics talk about, they were united more in spirit rather than aesthetics. You can kind of get a sense of this at the Bacardi art show. The Bacardi Gallery, probably you all know that building, but at the time they talk about how this is a very democratic exhibition space. You could go in and sign up, and so Gala, you know, kind of got together and was able to make this exhibition happen. I believe this is the second exhibition of Gala, one of a number. Which again, the program was written by George Volsky, who we heard about previously with the Pageant Gallery show. I think we've only really been able to identify from this show Fecundidad, which for me, of course, you know, has all kinds of associations with fertility, but I also think it speaks to the creative fecundity, the production that Soriano was really exploring in these years, the overabundance. And again, Gala really served as a forum, I think, a forum that, you know, in my mind was replacing what he had had in Cuba, a place where he could engage with other artists. Jose Gomez Sicre calls Gala a guild in one of his essays about the group. And I think there, again, here's an image of Soriano and Salinas at that same exhibition. I think that shared collective spirit, forum for intellectual discovery, more scholarship could come out thinking about Soriano's work in terms of the work of those other artists, thinking about the exchanges that they were all having among one another. So I'll quickly just go through a few more slides that were produced and exhibited along with the other Gala artists so that you can have a sense of the kind of variation, the experimental nature of his works, we can begin to see the emergent, mature practice that he starts to develop at this time. And this kind of ping-ponging between these flat, planar forms that, again, for me, there's a searching quality to these almost figurative abstractions. And then I just end my essay with a mention to the journey into self. This was a work from the second solo exhibition that Soriano had, which again was shown at the Bacardi Art Gallery. And for me, this really becomes a solidifying of his artistic practice that for the past decade he was really experimenting with in these various forums, really starting anew. So, thank you.
I want to thank Hortensia and Lisa and Alejandro for making this research possible. It was fascinating to work in this kind of super ideal way for art historians, where we get to go and stay immersed in the paintings with the archives at our fingertips. And so it was quite an honor and pleasure to work on this project. So I'm going to pick up where Susanna left off. And I am going to read my remarks, actually, kind of like CAA, but hopefully not. I am going to talk about the 1970s, which is the period in which Alejandro Anreus has very rightfully argued that Soriano kind of establishes all the visual tools that he needs as a painter to construct really his body of work from this point forward for the rest of his life. So writing about Soriano's work from the 70s presented me with a formidable challenge. As I embarked on this research, I wondered how I was going to contextualize paintings that purposefully evade the particulars of time and space. So as an art historian, I see my task as that of drawing connections between artworks and the historical and social conditions under which they were made and shown. But Soriano's paintings make this difficult, his paintings of the 70s in particular. How was I going to make a case for the historical specificity of paintings that I see as so obstinately non-specific, whose immense power lies in their capacity to generate associative thinking, emotional responses that take us away from recognizable spatial and temporal coordinates, that picture realms outside of time and space, that bring into view imagined realms, even mirages. Alejandro Anreus and Ricardo Paulosa have both keenly observed the visual complexity of these paintings, and they have helped me grasp their precision, despite the prevalence of shapes that are best described as floating signifiers. To see, for instance, how a work like this, Paisaje Errante, presents a spatial configuration that appears to vacillate amongst various reference. It could picture a scene under the depths of the ocean, a view of the vast cosmos, an interiorized psychological landscape. To see that there are shapes that echo parts of the human body, orifices, curves, smooth, translucent surfaces, to see that light suggests points of connection, the presence of life and spiritual forces, and that shadow connotes deep space, weight, presence, and absence. And I would say that despite the resemblance to landscapes, and actually perhaps because of the resemblance to landscapes, that many of the paintings from this period really, their power is derived from this immense capacity to kind of shapeshift right in front of our very eyes. many scholars have remarked that the power of these paintings lie in this generative mode of addressing us as viewers. Their forms offer very satisfying viewing because of the multiplicity suggested by their forms. The supposed fundamentals of painting, such as figure and ground or foreground and background, vacillate, and the ambiguity of their forms is given further power by the rigorous visual language by which Soriano constructs them. Precise line, defined shape, and carefully laid down layers of paint, and his incredibly masterful use of color, which many have remarked upon. And yet at the same time, his language maintains ties to the world. He deploys metaphor to speak of the landless condition of exile. El remanso eterno suggests a closed-off mass or interior landscape, whereas la soledad, we can see a figure floating over a landscape that itself also appears to be floating. Soriano developed this language during the first decade of exile, from 1962 when he settled in Miami, or the Miami area, I should say, to the mid-1970s when he began to show in the burgeoning art scene of South Florida. When he and his family moved to the Miami area in 1962, they were part of the largest wave of Cuban exiles to emigrate to the United States. So this is one of the kind of puzzles that I wanted to tackle in this essay, is how do you take this like immense history, right? This painful history that's experienced by individuals as well as a community, and kind of understand his paintings in relationship to them. The historian Michael Bustamante characterizes Cuban exile of this moment as, quote, a terrain of conflict and disappointment. And his observation that the exile community of South Florida was working through, quote, competing memory formations, I think evokes the ethos of Soriano's visual language. And despite Soriano's avoidance of politics, he participated in exhibitions of Cuban art launched by leaders of the exile community, shows that were meant to help forge a sense of cultural unity despite divisive politics and memories that lacked coherence. In fact, you could say it was even more important because of this divisiveness and this the ungroundedness of any kind of common memory. By the 1970s, Cuban artists had become a prominent group in the Miami area, even though their approaches to making art were diverse. Soriano was a key figure in this emerging scene, and it is no coincidence that his most active period of artistic production in the United States, from the mid-1970s to the early 80s, coincided with when opportunities to show in exhibitions of Cuban artists were expanding. In 1978, he participated in an astounding number of 11 group shows. By the end of the 1970s, it is important to note that many variants of the term Latin American were used in exhibitions of Soriano's work. Calling Soriano Latin American indicated a desire on the part of critics and curators to position him, and also I would say Cubans more generally, within a group of international cosmopolitans. The famous curator, Jose Gomez-Sicre, who was the curator of the OAS and a hemispheric promoter of Latin American art, embraced Soriano. He forwarded him as an exemplar of the so-called universalist tendencies of abstract Latin American art. And there's evidence that Soriano's work helped Gomez-Sicre mount an argument for a universalist strain of abstract Latin American painting that implicitly promoted freedom and countered the impression that realist painting dominated the region. While I would argue that Soriano's painting is too visionary and too specific to satisfy Gomez-Sicre's agenda, there is no question that his painting constitutes a form of oppositional modernism. Although his work takes on the appearance of an eminently personal expression, it is important that we understand it as a practice that was enormously responsive to the circumstances of exile and the activities of a lively community of Cuban and Latin American artists in the United States. During the 70s, the horizon lines of compositions such as Pasaje Errante and La Soledad, and their ambiguous body-like shapes and mysterious spatial territories presented scenes of longing. These scenes encourage our imaginations to roam, not so much as an exercise in escaping reality, I would argue, but rather as one of exploring the dark corners of territories, both within and without our corporeal and spatial boundaries. Thank you very much.
I want to start by thanking Hortensia and Lisa for this wonderful opportunity, the same as Alejandro. This has been, as Harper mentioned, a dream project for us to explore, to learn, and also to stay at the foundation in the house and be immersed in the space, in his habitat, as well as look at the personal papers. So I was tasked with defining the late style, and this is totally arbitrary. I have to say that I start with 1987. It was the decade of the 1990s, but I decided to make it a long decade, 1987 to 2002. And some of the concerns that I'm interested in my essay is the spirituality and the impact of exile, the aesthetic concerns of space-time and the fourth dimension, the mechanics of bodies and luminous beings, as well as the last years and the end of a brilliant career. So I have like 18 slides, so I'll go very quickly. So I start with this work, trying to define the late period. This is La Liturgia del Silencio from 1987. And as I mentioned, this idea of spirituality and the impact of exile, I was very interested in recovering the voice of the artist. One of the conversations that we had with Alejandro, with Lisa, and with Hortensia is that the artist, Rafael Soriano, was a quiet, introspective person. So trying to understand the work in his own words became paramount to me. And in terms of the spirituality and the impact of exile, in 1992 he said that exile launched him into an internal search, into a subjective world and a spiritual world. So 1987, this is the painting that he submits to one of the most important Hispanic exhibitions of the boom years of Latin American art, the Coors Hispanic exhibition that circulated throughout the nation, but at the same time it was a contest. So this was the painting that received the first prize. And his work traveled to 10 cities in the country. But what is interesting about this one is how the way that he explains it, and I'm going to quote, he says, "I seek to represent that instance in which, through a metamorphosis, light and shadow become one, for that is the optimal instant of the creative art. My paintings are about the freedom of that instant, whose very substance is the long contemplation and the innumerable hours needed to complete each work. This instant of freedom is not defined by sequential time, but by the enduring life of an image in the imagination. It is in the representation of time, turned into light and form, that the moment of creative vision is expressed in a manner that transcends the fleeting nature of reality. My paintings take from the dream its poetry of transformations, and from various concepts of the spirit, the urgency human beings feel to liberate themselves from the confines of earthly temporality."
As you see, this is what Harper was showing. It's very difficult to say exactly this is the late period, so there is a transition in the 1980s towards this style. The interlocking biomorphics of shapes and articulated elements that you see present in many of his works, the seemingly ethereal, astral and otherworldly, like an encounter of other beings that you see represented in this composition. And at the same time, we've mentioned about color, but also is the luminosity. One of the things that he was very much interested is physics and the mechanics of physics. One of the things that I learned through another artist, Maria Luisa Pacheco, was how to create the luminosity. And it is the thin layers of oil applied with pigment, and as the light hits the canvas, it reflects back and creates that internal luminosity that is present in his work. So this is Fuerza Cósmica, 1987 as well. There is a sequence in terms of his preoccupations. One of the things of the technique that Hortensia mentioned to me is that because it's oil painting, he would have 2 or 3 paintings going at the same time, and they would take 3 or more months to complete each. So there's a way that it's not exactly series, but you can see some affinities. In terms of this Fuerza Cósmica Metamorfosis Sideral of 1988, there is an interest in the mechanics on the structure of the composition and the elements, the interaction of planes and forms. Here is where I'm going to talk a little bit about the aesthetic concerns of space-time and the 4th dimension. And I was talking to Susanna about it, and I hope you elaborate a little bit more about that. But there was this very interesting preoccupation with space and time and the 4th dimension, which Soriano called the true artistic creation, the true dimension. So I had a hard time, and I spent several months thinking about this. What is the 4th dimension? How does he interpret it? And it is a very interesting thing. The 4th dimension, he says, as he says, the true artistic creation, the true dimension. The 4th dimension is a unified physics concept affecting cosmology and astrophysics as events that are not defined spatially or temporarily. To understand Soriano's art, it would be the extension of the 3 dimensions, providing further possibilities for forms to fold and move as a tesseract. So it's a form that is just folding into its sides, but it's constantly in movement. It's not three-dimensional because it's just like it becomes something else. And that is what, in a way, you see, that is what he is depicting. It's the tesseract is a 4-dimensional hypersurface cube that rotates and folds around every edge with 8 cubical sides. So Soriano's paintings capture the 4 dimensions as forms turning in and out of themselves as fluid and constant folding structures, yet capturing by him on the bidimensional pictorial space. One of the things that I was very, very surprised, this has to do with my upbringing in Colombia, was Mecánica Popular. This is the magazine in which he was artistic director. This was a magazine that circulated in my house. So it was impossible not to connect this essay with Mecánica Popular and the idea of physics, the exposure to everything that was happening with the space age, with the exploration, with the Cold War, exploration of space, the solar system, the new technologies, the Voyager 1, Voyager 2, as well as the close-up color images of outer space and planets. One of his quotes, talking about this 4th dimension, he said, "I'm trying to find, exploring through a magical quality, an unknown world that exists in the other dimensions or higher planes and that has nothing to do with material reality or with the material reality that surrounds us. My painting is subjective because in this state I try it allowed to penetrate astral worlds and receive ideas for paintings." So this is El Manto from 1974, and in a way it predates what would come later, such as the painting El Sueño Guardado, Guarded Dream of 1991, and as you see from 1987, there is this evolution, but a continuation of these compositions. Here, talking about Mecánica Popular, the exploration of a space, you see the veils of luminosity and shapes entering and exiting the space beyond the physical. This is what I see, of course. It's open for interpretation and to an argument as well. But it is a way that it can remind one of what was happening in stellar bodies, constellations, supernova. And they become paintings as immersive experiences. One of the things that has been mentioned has been the color, the use of color, and he was a colorist, amazing colorist. This is Espejismos de Agua, and it is visual memory of Bahía de Matanzas. It's not only the spatial, but also the physical space that he remembers changing colors 5 or 6 times a day. And the ribbons that are present in other of the paintings in this period move, creating dynamic representations. So I'm gonna go quickly with these works from the 1990s. And as you see, the incredible color, I am totally biased for blue, so you see a lot of blue here. But they become, in a way, the nocturnes as well. And in the mechanics of bodies and luminous beings, I was very, very interested in that connection with Hortensia. I just noticed that there is some morphological, some of attention to the mechanics of bodies. And I always thought that it was an influence from Hortensia, and she mentioned to me that Rafael would go to her practice and look at all the manuals, the anatomical manuals and catalogs, and became very interested. And thinking about that, you see those connections, not exactly fair representations, but it's just the connections of ligaments, of muscles, of how a body could work. Along this line, there is also the representation in terms of the cabezas, which he started in the 1940s and take really a prominent space in the 1980s, 1990s. It's un mecanismo cósmico. Okay, so we go to the last years and the end of brilliant career. Rafael Soriano experienced some health problems in 1996, which required him undergoing heart surgery, quadruple bypass surgery. And in conversation with Hortensia, it seems that the doctors agreed that the surgery affected his health. So this is the time in which there is a notable change. You see the colors before, and you start seeing this interest in yellows, purples, and blues. It is also the time in which he was diagnosed with dementia. In looking at what behavioral neurological insights talk about dementia and artists, psychiatrists say that there is in the early stages, there is a burst of creative, visual creativity, and then moving on to gradual cognitive and behavioral deficits. And you start seeing this sort of more simplified compositions, more defined in the planes, and this emphasis on purple and yellow. So the demarcation of planes, it's like a 180-degree going back to the early work that Susanna mentioned. And so this is now Del Universo, one of the last works. And in a way, talking about the exile and about the journey, it's a final view into a fantastic traveling path and exploration of worlds. Thank you.
It's almost over. I know it's been a long night. Okay. Well, we hear the word metaphysical, spiritual, esoteric when speaking of Soriano. And what does that mean exactly? They're used really loosely, but I'm going to attempt to explain the spiritual context that he was working in. And I begin with Theosophy. Now, Theosophy began in 1875. It was an invented movement by a Russian immigrant named Helena Blavatsky, pictured here with the co-director, Olga. She came to the United States, to New York specifically, to begin the movement because she saw that Europe was dead, and it was the Americas that would be the place of spiritual awakening. What was Theosophy? That's difficult to say. It didn't require memberships. There wasn't a church. Obviously, it was begun by a woman. There were many, many women members. Everyone participated equally. This was a really radical stance because most religions, especially Catholicism, are misogynistic. They don't allow women to participate. So this was radical in and of itself. Then the other thing she did was introduce to the West aspects of Eastern mysticism. It was Theosophy that first used the word yoga. No one knew what that was. Meditation, reincarnation. So we actually have a lot to thank her for. When she decided to retire, she passed on the leadership to another woman, Annie Besant, who you're seeing here, and she was even more radical. She had been jailed in France for supporting birth control. She was an ardent women's rights activist, and she also did the impossible. She opened up Freemasonry to women. She did it only in France. England resisted, but really she opened a lot of co-Masonic lodges worldwide, so she was a real mover. And it was Besant, with her co-director, Ledbetter, who published a really important book in 1901. It was called Thought Forms, and it really changed the spiritual landscape globally. It was disseminated throughout the world. If you want, you can download it right now for free. And it's a very interesting small book, and I'm showing you 2 pages from it. So it was written or conceived by spirit mediums who looked into the 4th dimension and tried to express what those forms look like. It was often channeled from another plane. And one of the most important pages, I think, in the book was this color chart that you're seeing here, which stated very clearly all the esoteric meanings of color. This is incredibly important, especially when thinking about Soriano's choice of color. You know, the colors corresponded to what theosophists call vibrations, esoteric vibrations. And they would affect people very strongly who are looking at the artwork. Now, of course, now we know that really the invention of abstraction was thanks to Theosophy, because Kandinsky, Mondrian, now we know Hilma af Klint, were all pioneers in these theosophical ideas. You know, so again, looking at something like this portrait, you have to see the theosophical content of it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but when I first went to the Soriano archives, like many people, when sitting in front of an actual painting, I had an almost uncanny sensation. The paintings did possess an inner light, but it was as if they were alive. They were molten, moving. They glowed like embers, and that's important too. Because in Theosophy, there was a Buddhist idea that when meditating, especially in dark chambers, your inner light would come out and it would manifest as an aura. Anyway, by the way, the choice of this portrait, this particular person, Nicholas de Cusa, he would be a person known to a theosophist because he was an early Christian mystic from the 15th century who actually introduced the Christian Kabbalah into esotericism. The idea of individuals exuding colored auras and inner light was visually promoted by Theosophy, and Ledbetter went on to publish a number of illustrated books that were widely disseminated throughout the world, especially in theosophical lodges. One of the most popular ones was his book, Man, Visible and Invisible. It was a mediumistic view of a person's aura revealing itself. So these are illustrations of a person with a very high consciousness, surrounded by colors, and you'll note that from the crown of the head emanates golden light, indicating a spiritual person. So gold and purple together might have theosophical meaning. Again, inner light emanating from this person. You know, the title, you can't but help think of Khalil Gibran's 1923 classic. It was translated into over 100 languages. In fact, second to the Bible, it was the most translated book. Another 2 pages from Thought Forms. So the other thing that Thought Forms promoted was that if you were a sensitive spiritual person, you could approach an environment and in a way, especially if you were an artist, channel the energetic presence that was in the room. So for example, this is a medium's view of an accident, and you can see clashing colors. The other thing that it promoted was listening to music opened up the portals of your spirit, and imagery could flow then into your consciousness. On fire. And I wanted just to show you the 2 different pictures because I think the colors come out really differently. So the inevitable connection between these images and esoteric beliefs, I think, is pretty inescapable, especially when thinking about the astral plane and the language of theosophy. It had to have meaning for him, and I'll get into that in more detail. You know, I like to think of Soriano in a way as a channeler, just the way he stands in front of this feeling. It's a dark background, and the images then emerge. It's not a conventional vision. It kind of transcends ideas of time and space. Another very important movement and person connected to theosophy was Rudolf Steiner. And Steiner in Germany led the Theosophical Society. But then at a certain point, he began his own organization called Anthroposophy. And this had many of the beliefs of theosophy, except it focused on Christian mysticism and kind of rejected the Eastern aspects of it. But one of the interesting things about Steiner was he used architecture and painting, particularly abstract painting, in environments to change the feelings of the people that were in it. So you can see this amazing building. It's now destroyed, unfortunately. But the frescoes look a lot like abstract Soriano work. And they were meant to change consciousness. In 1947, the Cuban Ministry of Education and Culture sent Soriano to Mexico. And there we see him standing in front, of a Diego Rivera mural in front of the Palacio Nacional and on the steps of the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan, typical tourist destinations for an artist visiting Mexico for the first time. But now things are going to get interesting. We know Soriano was a Rosicrucian, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And we have from the archives these very interesting photographs. We see here Rosicrucian initiates celebrating the solstice. Amarak stands for the Ancient and Mystic Order of the Rosy Cross, and they are from the Lodge of Quetzalcoatl. The members of the Lodge of Quetzalcoatl came from Mexican intelligentsia. They were the top intellectuals and political leaders of the time. And here they're posed in front of, some building at Teotihuacan. And I think it's interesting that the Mexican government gave them permission to go to Teotihuacan at night and have rituals on top of the Pyramid of the Sun. And the Lodge of Quetzalcoatl was very nationalistic, and there was also a Masonic Quetzalcoatl Lodge. Here's another. This is the female initiates. Like I said, women participated equally. This was very important, again, for women usually excluded by Catholicism. Now, where did he get all these theosophical ideas? He got them in his hometown. Hortensia just told me that his sister Lilia was a theosophist and brought him to the temple at their local area. And that's very, very significant. So he came from a family, like you said, his father was a seer, his sister was involved in theosophy. He probably heard many, many lectures there. And in Cuba, by the way, Cuba had the first theosophical lodge in the Americas. And theosophy came to Cuba in the late 19th century, but the Catholic Church suppressed it. In 1902, after independence, lodges opened up all over the island, and they were very popular. Why were they popular? Because Cubans equated theosophy as a religion with modernity. Why? Because it promoted tolerance, universal fraternity, racial and gender equity, and intellectualism, and very importantly, science. It pushed people to scientifically explore the supernatural. In the center is a beautiful drawing that Soriano did for a lodge event. And you can see that there is a Masonic symbol. So Rosicrucians, Freemasons, Theosophists, they all kind of belong to the same lodges. They met in the same places, and often people were members of all three. You can also see that there's sculptures, and Hortensia thinks that maybe he created them, a portrait bust of Olga and also Blavatsky. And this lodge is still up and running. His sister Lilia asked him to do these portraits, and these are all famous theosophists. He must have copied them from photographs, and I think they're still hanging there. I don't know if you know who all these people are, but they are the important people. There's Gandhi in the center. And I'm almost done. So a lot needs to be done looking at the spiritual environment around Soriano. Was he a theosophist? I think that the ideas of theosophy greatly influenced him, and he grew into them as he got older. He was thinking about them. Theosophy does not demand membership, dues. There's no church to go to. Actually, with theosophy, you would listen to lectures. There were online courses. It was very egalitarian and could influence you, especially as you got older, with its belief in life after death. And I'll end here and remind you that in a theosophical ideology, purple is the highest vibration color. And as it twists and turns, it looks almost like a hooded figure merging from the darkness into a higher state of consciousness. And I think actually that is what many of Soriano's later works is an evolution, especially at the end of his life, into a more spiritual state. Thank you.
Well, why don't we open up to some questions and comments from the audience, since we do have a few minutes. And considering this is such a distinguished audience, I know that there's questions and comments. I was going to call on you, Edward, so go ahead, please.
No, I thought all the talks were lovely and very, very filled with information. I would like to ask Susan, what happened to Soriano and his theosophical interest in Miami? How did that, were there lodges, were there ways that he could continue his communication with other members of this group or like-minded individuals? And I just was curious to know, because the transition from Matanzas, Havana to Miami was very abrupt. So how did this affect his spiritual, philosophical development, if you can venture a guess at that?
I will venture a guess. I've asked Hortensia, did he belong to any lodges? And she says no, not to her knowledge. And he was a very private person. He had a deep inner life. He could have very easily connected to written materials, but I don't think he did. I think he had absorbed it in Cuba, but it had greater meaning for him as he was in exile and suffered in a different way. So I think he absorbed the tenets, probably mixed it in with Rosicrucian ideas because he was Christian. So that Rosicrucianism is Christian in nature, even though it is mystical. So no, I think it was a remnant of the past. Thanks.
Okay, could I ask one other question of any of Elizabeth or Susan or anybody? Arguably, I think that his paintings that are best known now are the geometric works, and they seem so much at odds with the later, more theosophical or philosophical or spiritually infused works. Do any of you see a direct link or an indirect link between the hard edge abstraction and these very fluid pictures that he began to do in the 60s?
I think there is definitely a link. First, there's a material link. I think if you look at his work compared to the other artists associated with the Concreto movement, he tends to be the more painterly of the entire group. But aside from that, there's certain titles that definitely bring up notions of metaphysics, etc. And here I would say something which I think you pointed out already. I think to a certain extent, the interest in the geometrics reflects the marketplace and the focus of certain collectors in focusing on that kind of art and that art being promoted. But I would repeat something that I've said before about Soriano. I think in Cuba, Soriano was a very good painter, but I think he truly became a great painter in exile. I think the sense of loss and trauma is what transformed him into this extraordinary painter. And the coloristic structures that he explores in the geometrics really take off, I think, and bloom in the more oniric, even though I don't particularly like that word, but maybe it has to do with the person who first used it in an essay, but that's neither here nor there. But I think the other important thing is that the nature of painting for him was a constant, right? And you see that in how he approaches geometry. But also, I think there's a really fascinating conversation with the technique of painting and his own connection with, for example, 17th century Spanish painting. I was fortunate enough to have met him when I was a kid, and he was fascinated by the work of Zurbarán and the work of Velázquez and the work of Rembrandt also. And so that kind of material chromatic quality, I think, carries from the geometric into the mature great work after the trauma of exile. But anyone else, feel free to.
I'll just, can you hear me? Yeah. I'll just add a little bit to what you were saying. I think it's very interesting to contemplate the geometrics and contemplate as we might do a Rothko or we might do some of the other great minimalist artists. Because if you contemplate these works, you'll see within the colors that there are more colors. So it's a very interesting, it's never quite flat. It's not like a Kelly or Franz Klein. They are colors that emanate other colors from within. And so you see the nucleus of what becomes this later style. But the works themselves are really quite fascinating if you look at them, and I understand their popularity. I agree that it is a seed, and it is a seed from which he evolves and from which his work really evolves. But there is that connection between the physical and the metaphysical, that they are born of the same seed, and he just develops one a little bit more. And I'll just also add that when we went to Cuba and we talked to one of his students, and she saw the late works, she actually began to weep because she said, I always thought his works, his geometric works, his concrete works were special, but he always told me he was not satisfied with them. Now I understand what he was trying to tell me.
Just having looked at the mid-70s paintings a lot, I think they're filled with structure, and I think they're what's really interesting hearing you all speak about the geometric paintings is they do seem to be they're obviously architectural, and they refer to the world outside of the painting and space as existing architecturally outside of the painting. And then with the mid-70s works, it really becomes like the world of the painting, which, thinking about what painting does for us, why do people still paint? Why is painting important? He really raises like super profound questions about what can happen inside of a painting in terms of space and our relationship to space and time.
I just wanted to add that I think that's a really important point, because I think that these kind of interior psychological morphologies were also explored by Roberto Mata, the Chilean painter, surrealist painter. And so you can see a lot of this inner world reflected in Soriano, much as Mata was exploring in the same way.
Well, let's not forget that hard-edged geometry, think of Malevich and Kandinsky and Mondrian, really was spiritual in nature. So maybe there is a continuity in meaning.
It was the other person I was going to call on. Marcela.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Edward, for prompting that question and that great topic. I just wanted to say that I just want to echo what everyone is saying, because it's so fascinating to think about that period of transition between the geometric abstraction and the more kind of lyrical, spiritual kind of works. And one work that I've always liked, and the Whitney just acquired, La Noche, which was in Susanna's presentation. I think the reason why we were so drawn to that work, especially in the context of the Whitney, because it has such a strong holdings of abstract expressionism, geometric abstraction, etc., was because of that, precisely that juncture between the geometric side and this other side. And you see in that work, on the left side, the more abstract hard edge kind of shapes facing this moon, right? And so this kind of more, as opposed to internal, looking into himself, which you've all talked so brilliantly about, but kind of more external, right? And we have to remember, it's 1970, that work. 1969 was a moon landing. So kind of thinking also more externally at what was happening philosophically in the world and who we are in the context of the universe. So I just want to echo that that's such a brilliant and like so profound phase, I think, of his life, and to keep questioning and for more research to come out from this incredible Catalogue Raisonné. So thank you, everyone. Yeah.
More questions or comments?
I'm just curious to know if during this whole process there were any surprises or maybe some ideas that were reinforced of what your experience with the work from the beginning to the end of the project.
Well, I'll just answer very quickly. The surprises, I mean, Soriano is a surprise. Soriano's work is very surprising. It may be even, in some way, it's very fascinating in both senses of and interpretations of that word, where you're horrified in a certain way, but fascinated and keep looking. I think I've been with Soriano so long that I don't have surprises with his work anymore, as I initially did. But the surprises actually came from the conversation. So I see a lot of overlap between what Olga was saying and Susan was saying and I was saying. And, so we come at it from different viewpoints, but then we're actually able to kind of see some of these leitmotifs that appear. And that's surprising. So I've really enjoyed the conversation here tonight with my peers, my colleagues. Thank you.
I'll say that working on the transitional decade was really surprising because I was more familiar with his work, done in Cuba and then also the work done in Miami. But those transitional 12 years that I tackled, they really kind of throw you for a loop. They change so much within a year because he's doing this constant experimentation. But I'll also say, I had a very different experience than what you mentioned, Harper, because I think I really was so rooted in the context and the historical moment. And I found out, I'm from Miami, so it really helped me learn a lot about that particular period. I think Gala as a group is a really interesting, incipient group that was mostly Cubans, but calling themselves Latin Americans, learning about the Kubik Center at UM. And I'll just say, I called UM and I asked them what this was about, and they didn't know. So it was really fascinating that there was this whole, it wasn't just Soriano, this esteemed professor, but Supreme Court justices from Cuba who were then teaching in this an extension program where, yeah, you could learn English and you could learn, how to function in a new society, but you could also take painting, or you could take really advanced courses. So for me, like really learning about the Miami context that Soriano was a part of and helped shape was really revealing. And I think, I called Miami a cultural backwater in that moment, but like you can see that development in that period. So it was fascinating for me.
I think you were very kind calling it a culture.
I was shocked, is the word I would use, by how pioneering he was. When we think today, especially after the Hilma af Klint show at the Guggenheim, how artists are obsessed with spirituality, here was a person literally painting the evolution of consciousness itself, and it was morphing before our very eyes. I mean, these are magical paintings. How is he not better known? He really has to take his place in the canon of spiritual art, which has in general been marginalized. So I can understand the dual marginalization. However, the quality, these are really special paintings.
Okay, these are archival surprises and delights, I'll say. And this was part of the process of being able to work on a Catalogue Raisonné project, with such an immersive, archive experience attached to it. It was really interesting to be able to see how he was surviving as an artist, and you could see, I was so shocked and delighted to see that he had shown in, juried shows at synagogues in Miami with Armenian immigrants and Jewish immigrants, and that, in the early 70s. And then by 81, he's invited to the Cotejer Biennial in Medellin and has a solo show, and is invited to Costa Rica. And he's beginning to see himself as a Latin American artist, and you can see that's so important to him. And so that was really exciting as, a researcher.
I follow on Harper's in terms of the archive, and I just found it fascinating, especially this idea that he's a very quiet, very intellectual person. But in those interviews that he gives for the Cotejer Biennial, he's just really explaining deeply his art. So it was fantastic to see, to read what he was thinking at the moment.
I would add to that to me it wasn't so much a surprise, but going back to Susan's comment, that the longer you live with this work, the more you have to ask yourself the question of why hasn't he received the attention that he deserves? Because he truly is an extraordinary painter. And I am obviously, very old-fashioned in my belief in painting as something essential. And I think it's just an extraordinary example that this man, very modestly and quietly, in this small studio in the back of his house, went in there every day and produced this extraordinary body of work because he had a commitment to it. He had a vision about it. So it's not surprising, but it's also incredibly refreshing and life-affirming in the kind of world that we live in today, to encounter an artist with such a profound sense of vocation as opposed to career. Because painting was his vocation. And I think that's extraordinary. Yes, sir.
So I find it interesting that you relate his works to Mata, which I can see. When I first was exposed to Soriano's work, I thought of Basiotes. And I'm wondering, do you think that he was exposed to Basiotes' work and maybe the early biomorphic work of Stamos at all?
That is a great question. Go ahead.
I can actually add to that in 1947, he had 2 trips outside of Cuba, one to Mexico and the other one to the United States. He came to New York, and we know that in New York, he visited the Museum of Modern Art, he visited the Metropolitan, and he visited the galleries. I never heard this directly from him, but someone who knew him somewhat, who was José Gómez Sicre, believed that he must have seen the work of Basiotes and the early work of Rothko during that trip to New York, which I think is a possibility.
Interesting.
I think that's a great answer. I mean, you know, in The Artist is Mystic, we actually compare his work. One of our essays compares his work to Mata as well as many others. But it's that interesting aspect of really, and I think we've touched on this in many different ways, of Soriano after the traumatic experience. Instead of facing outward in the outward world, he goes inward and he really contemplates. And I actually entitled my essay I can't remember the title, but I used St. John of the Cross, The Darkness of the Soul, you know, the dark night of the soul. Because I think he had many dark nights, and he painted at night. And I think that kind of interior exploration where he's thinking of the psyche and the spirituality and the metaphysical, those were issues that were very important to him as a human as well as an artist. And so I think that that was his locus. I think that he was very true to himself. And I think that that is explained a lot in these kind of almost psychologically morphological paintings, which have architecture and that idea of thought and containing the desires. So that exploration is different for each human, right? And so the commonality, though, is there with that exploration and that imagination and how it's manifested.
Now, he was obviously really true to himself, and I think, from my perspective, he created a totally unique and non-derivative body of work, which is incredible.
I agree, yeah.
One more question or comment, please. Well, please visit. Oh, one more, sorry.
This is actually a question for Hortensia. Did you learn anything new about your father and his work by working on the Catalogue Raisonné and through this process? I'll give you back the mic.
Now you need the mic.
Well, I mean, I guess, no, I didn't really learn anything new because my father was always working. And what was fascinating to me was the actual archives. That was surprising, that everything he ever did in Cuba, we recovered, and everything he did in the United States, we recovered. And if you look at the archives, there's about this much of Cuba, and the rest is all the United States. That's what was kind of shocking to me, that he worked more here in the United States than he ever did in Cuba. And yeah, I mean, for me, it's been an emotional journey, these archives. And thanks to my spouse, Lisa, I mean, they were all in boxes, and I would become paralyzed, you know, and she really was the one that dug in there and put these archives together. So yeah, I mean, you know, yeah.
You know, I just want to say my last fantasy of Soriano, because I have a fantasy, and you reminded me of it by mentioning Rothko, because the paintings look great in museums, but I can't help but think it would be great to have the Soriano chapel. You know, like the Rothko chapel, because they're so powerful, and that some of them are really big and altar-like, and they really affect you. It would be nice to create something like that, even if it was temporary. I think he would really like that.
Isn't there a piece of land in front of the house?
We're taking donations.
Any other comments or questions? Well, please visit the Catalogue Raisonné and tell your friends about it. Put the word out there. Rafael Soriano is an extraordinary painter. Thank you so much.